You're in the waterloop.
Waterloop.
Hey everyone, this is Travis with Waterloop. I know a lot of people want to use water-efficient fixtures, but they're afraid they won't work as well. Let me tell you about High Sierra showerheads, which was named Best Showerhead by Popular Science. I just installed one at my house, and I was genuinely surprised at the power and coverage of the water. High Sierra showerheads earn the EPA WaterSense label for water efficiency. They use at least 40% less water than the conventional low-flow showerheads. High Sierra showerheads are constructed out of metal, so there's no plastic involved, they're very durable, and they're naturally antibacterial. One of my favorite things, these showerheads are made in the USA by a small business located in the Sierra Nevada foothills. Get 20% off with promo code WATERLOOP at highsierrashowerheads.com.
Waterloop.
Welcome to Waterloop. This is Travis. Going to be talking about the Chesapeake Bay today with Tim Wheeler. He is associate editor and senior writer with the Bay Journal. Tim, how's it going?
Going great. Couldn't ask for more.
I'm glad to talk to you. We crossed paths back when I worked at the Chesapeake Bay program in Annapolis, and you were a reporter for the Baltimore Sun.
That's right.
I was just thinking as I was getting ready to talk to you about how I was always happy to send information and news your way because I knew that it would be reported fairly and accurately, which is all you really can ask for from a journalist. So glad to have you still working on Bay issues.
And I'm glad to be doing it still.
Yeah.
A little dismayed that I'm still doing it 30 plus years after I started.
Yeah. Well, I'm dismayed that there's been such big cuts to environmental reporting, at newspapers around the country. And I know that, the Baltimore Sun was not immune to that phenomenon just of general cutbacks to newsrooms, right, and to editorial staffs. But I think environmental reporting at, traditional media outlets was a special part of kind of those cuts, right?
It was. I mean, the environment beat has often been seen as as an extra or something that was expendable. The Sun, to their credit, has had an environment beat, sort of consistently since, before I got there. And they maintained it, and they still have one. It reached a high point when I was there. We had, 3 to 5 people, who at least some part of their reporting responsibilities involved covering the Bay and the environmental issues, whether it was an Eastern Shore correspondent or I covered growth for a while, and a lot of that was about smart growth and the environmental impacts of growth. It dwindled down to just one reporter, in the 5 to 10 years ago time frame. I was, and when I left in 2015, I begged them, pleaded with them, told them they would be crazy if they didn't replace me, and they did. And the new reporter is Scott Dance is doing a great job. He has a couple of additional responsibilities that I didn't have. And so, one of the things that has happened is that you get pulled off more and more to do other things. Just as the newsroom shrinks, it's harder to be able to afford to have beats. And I think the unfortunate thing for the environment is it's a complicated topic. It benefits from having somebody who can really dig into it and get familiar with the issues and the complications, the science and the policy and the law. And so there's that challenge. On the other hand, I mean, there's been a growth, I think, in nonprofit journalism. The Bay Journal has grown. I was added in 2016, and we have reporters in Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia now. And there are other media, Virginia Mercury and Virginia. And locally here in Baltimore, the Baltimore Brew, all those have sort of stepped in and covered environmental issues that, are maybe not getting as much attention in the mainstream media as they used to. If only we had a little more reach, that would be the benefit.
Sure. And I know that some nonprofits are helping to fund environmental journalism in some cases. I think one example that pops up is for the New Orleans, NOLA.com, and down there, I think they've had some funding that's helped get some reporters in there to cover coastal issues and everything. And then there's these kind of environmental media outlets. You mentioned the Bay Journal. There's this water desk that's out west now that's doing some stuff. So kind of trying to fill that void when, like you said, traditional media outlets have kind of cut back. It makes sense. Baltimore is on the bay, right? And the Chesapeake is just such a vital part of that area and that region in many ways that you can't just walk away from that beat entirely. It just couldn't be done.
You can't. You look at a map. The bay is central to Maryland. It cuts right through the state in a way more than any of the others. In Virginia, sort of off to the side. Not saying that Virginians don't care about the bay, they really do, and they relish it as well. But for Maryland, it's been sort of a central part of the state's identity.
Yeah, as a Maryland native, I agree with that. The bay is more ours than Virginia's, so I'll stick with that. So speaking of the bay, I really am curious. Like I said, I used to work at the Chesapeake Bay program and lived in Annapolis, worked at EPA in D.C. and I've still kept a close eye on how the bay is doing. But from your reporting, from your perspective, what's the current health right now of the bay? How's it doing, kind of based on those traditional indicators?
Well, it depends on your perspective. What kind of a time scale you want to use. If you want to look at just moment by moment, year by year, conditions vary. As you know, they go up and they go down. It's a little bit like an oscilloscope. And the weather plays a big factor. There's you can look at the report cards that are put out by the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science, for instance. In 2017, the bay got a C, which was like considered to be a really good grade. I don't know if my parents would have been happy with C's when I was in school, but that was progress. The last couple of years have been rough. We had incredible amounts of rainfall, record river flows, and all that rain and runoff created runoff and non-point pollution that had a whammy effect on water quality and some of the indicators. So the grade of the latest report card that came out a few weeks ago was a C minus. So it slipped. And if you look at some things like bay grasses, they're off considerably from their high point in 2017. They had surpassed 100,000 acres, which was, the highest that they've been recorded since they started trying to bring the bay grasses back in the 80s, early 90s. And they're down around 67,000 acres now. So they took a big hit, about a third back.
Now, is that from what causes that? Is that all the sediment and everything coming out of those rivers kind of, it doesn't do good for those grass beds, or what's the decline from?
It's a combination of factors. The sediment, of course, clouds the water. So do the nutrients. They create, these big algae blooms. Sometimes and some of the growth that actually grows on the leaves of the bay grasses cuts off the sunlight. The less clear the water is, the harder the sunlight is to penetrate. It's like any garden. If you don't have sun, they don't grow. And some of the beds were smothered in sediment. In a few places, I know, you can actually have flows in rivers strong enough that they can actually uproot some of the grasses in places too. So this probably is a temporary thing. It should come back. And again, this is that perspective issue, though. The goal for the bay is 185,000 acres. So you can see that we're, even at 100,000 acres, we're still far short of what the goal is. And nobody thinks that 185,000 acres is what used to be out there. That was just a restoration goal.
Sure. And what about that iconic crab, the blue crab, which is, so carefully monitored? How's the crab doing there?
Well, I've been interviewing crabs, and they're, they were hard to find at the beginning of the spring. But the latest survey, maybe again, not surprising, but they're affected by weather too, though in different ways. It impacts their reproduction. If you know anything about crabs, they basically use the entire bay, and they spawn essentially near the mouth of the bay. The crab larvae essentially go out into the ocean and come back, and making that kind of a journey is always fraught with all kinds of issues. The latest survey found that they were down again by about a third from what they had been the previous year. Not entirely clear why that is. It wasn't a particularly bad winter, so the crabs didn't get frozen to death on the bottom, as has happened sometimes in the bay. But even with that, the numbers are within the bounds of what scientists say is a sustainable population. Female crabs are the ones that have to bear the babies. We're down by 40% or thereabouts, but they're still well above the lowest level that they've dropped before. And so folks think that things are not in terrible shape. We'll just have to wait and see what the next couple of years bring.
I mean,
meanwhile, you're going to be paying a premium for crabs.
I was going to say, yeah, it's going to be a little more expensive summer for all those folks that love their crabs.
Yes.
The harvest pressure is such a big part of how the population's doing too. I mean, there's been just years and years of figuring out the right restrictions on commercial crabbing and all that. But have they kind of settled into policy on that front, or?
Yeah, for the most part. They hit a real serious point about 12 years ago, around 2008 time frame, when there was real concern. At that point, all the numbers were pointing downward, and they were near the bottom of the scale in terms of what scientists thought was safe. And so they cut back significantly. There was a lot of, in fact, the federal government threw in some disaster relief money for the crab fishery then. It's the most important one in the bay. And they made some significant cutbacks in the season and the catch limits, and they were painful for the watermen to bear. And we saw the prices go up, of course. But they've been pretty consistent. Even as the crabs have improved, they have not thrown the doors wide open again. So, I mean, you get people saying we should be cutting back even more, but, within the bounds of these guardrails that the scientists have set, we're not at the target level where it would be, all roses, but we're also not, down where the flashing yellow lights are saying that we're in danger. So.
And then the rockfish, that's another kind of measure, something people look at. I've always been intrigued by looking at the population of rockfish versus the health of the rockfish, because I know that there's some history of, lesions and other kinds of concerns about how the fish actually are. So what's going on with those guys?
Well, again, your perspective matters. As I said, I've been doing this for decades, and back around in the early 80s, there was significant concern about striped bass, or rockfish as we call them here in the bay. And things were in such a dire strait in terms of the numbers and the trending, downward trending of the population, that Maryland and Virginia put on a moratorium throughout the bay. The bay is a major nursery for this species. It's the premier finfish in the bay, but it's also one of the top finfish for the Atlantic coast. These fish migrate up and down the coast, in their life cycle. And, catch restrictions were put on coastwide. Within 5 years, they came back, and they came back strong. To the point that sometimes the watermen would complain that there were too many striped bass. They were eating the crabs. But they've been sliding back down again. And so just within the past year, all the Atlantic states have put on catch restrictions again. Their aim is to reduce the mortality by about 18%. We're waiting to see if that is enough and if that's going to work. They do have an issue with, it's not clear exactly what's happening here. Part of it may be, that the water is so warm, especially in the summertime. Even if you catch them and release them, they may die. So the young ones may not be living very long if there's this high catch and release mortality. There's also an issue with the bacterial infections. A large percentage of the fish in the bay have some infection. Doesn't necessarily kill them outright, but it may be impeding their reproduction or their longevity. So
interesting. All right, well, let's shift from the critters in the water to the politics and the policy here.
It's the fun part.
Yeah. So the TMDL, the total maximum daily load, the pollution
Sure.
diet for the Chesapeake Bay, right? That was
Right.
established in the end of 2010. Really, this historic agreement, a TMDL that's of scope that's never been done before. I was at the Chesapeake Bay program in EPA, so that's kind of how I know all these talking points. What's the status of the work on that TMDL? It was they're supposed to meet the goals, have all the practices in place to reduce pollution by 2025. So 10 years in, 5 years to go. What's the assessment of where that stands?
Well, we're getting down to the second half, of whatever sports metaphor you want to use here, nearing the home stretch.
Yeah.
It's beginning to be apparent that while some of the states have done great work at, trying to meet their pollution reduction targets and are close, if not directly on target, they have they appear to be able to close the gap. They may be able to, I think. That's still a question. Pennsylvania in particular, and New York as well, which has a a lesser portion of the Bay watershed, are pretty far behind. And there's significant concern about whether they are able or willing to ramp up enough to meet those goals. And in fact, there's beginning to be talk that 2025, which was the target date that was set for meeting the TMDL, the pollution reduction goals of each state, is beginning to look like it's not going to be made. And it may not be made by all the states, because as they ratchet down pollution, they start with the so-called low-hanging fruit, the things that they know can work and that cost the least. And over time, now we're getting into the really hard stuff. They made great progress at reducing nutrient pollution coming out of wastewater treatment plants through upgrades to the plants. Those were not cheap, but they've been instituted pretty much throughout Maryland and Virginia. Some improvements being made in Pennsylvania as well. And so that's where you see the real gains in water quality that you can measure. On the non-point side, the runoff side, controlling pollution runoff from farms and from urban and suburban landscapes, much more challenging, much more expensive, and much less progress there. And unfortunately, that's where the bulk of the progress that has to come yet is on the non-point side. And so that's the big test, whether that will be achievable or not.
Yeah, you can take on these the discharges from wastewater plants through permitting and things like that. Agriculture is much less regulated. You've really got to do a lot of voluntary work on that front. And then the stormwater from cities and suburbs, development continues, like hotcakes in D.C. and Maryland and Virginia. So you're adding more paved surfaces, makes that tough too.
Right.
Lot of politics flying around. I've seen in, like you alluded to, with Pennsylvania and Maryland, Virginia. Then you've got EPA under the Trump administration. There's different lawsuits, I think, that are being looked at. Lawsuits against Pennsylvania because they're not doing their share.
At this point, the threat is mainly of lawsuits against EPA.
Okay.
The big issue here is, the TMDL was challenged in court after it was developed by the Farm Bureau, led by the Pennsylvania Farm Bureau, by home builders. It survived that court challenge. The decision was that this was a mutual thing. The EPA and the states were all in this together. That apparent bond is starting to fray pretty severely. With the evidence that Pennsylvania in particular is lagging so far behind, and the lack of apparent progress on their part in actually closing the gap, their latest plan that they submitted for reaching the 2025 goal didn't make any bones about it that they were not going to get there. And environmental groups, community groups, and states, even Maryland, have sort of put the heat on EPA to say, look, what are you going to do about this? And EPA under the Trump administration has said basically TMDLs are not enforceable, that it's up to the states to do what they're supposed to do. That's, and this is one for the lawyers to hash out. EPA, when they were developing the TMDL, had said there will be consequences if you don't meet the milestones. The consequences are fairly limited, as you know. It's a matter of taking away federal funds. In Pennsylvania's case, the big problem is they're not spending nearly enough to put in place the kinds of runoff controls and other pollution controls that they need. And the legislature there is unwilling to raise funds, either through taxes or through just allocating the money from other things. So you have sort of a political impasse. Maryland and Virginia and the Bay Foundation and other environmental groups have filed formal notice of intent to sue over the lack of enforcement of the TMDL. And the Trump administration is basically telling them they're wasting their time. And so we may see lawsuits before the year is out.
I guess it was always meant to go that way at some point. I think part of the thing that's tough is, Pennsylvania is not on the bay, right? That's not part of the fabric of their communities and their economy. They're upstream in the watershed. They've got the Susquehanna River. Same thing with New York. I mean, they've got a sliver of the bay. It's hard to motivate them to take action too. It's interesting.
It is. New York was kind of an unwilling partner in this whole process, a reluctant partner, if you will, along the way. And they've done, they've participated in the meetings, but have not been as out front. And in Pennsylvania, it's the politics there that the legislature is controlled by the Republicans. The governor's office currently is a Democrat. But the geography is probably the more compelling factor there, and the fact that they aren't on the bay, they don't have a direct role. Where folks have tried to sort of bend the curve on this is that they've pointed out that, improving water quality in Pennsylvania rivers and streams will benefit them as well as the bay. They have a huge number of impaired waterways, among the highest percentage in the country. This is a state that has had a long history of resource extraction, coal mining, oil and gas development, and impacts from that are still being felt in acid mine drainage in some waterways. And there's a lot of farming in some parts of the Bay watershed down towards the southeastern portion there. There's probably more animal units than there are people. And that those animal units manure is being spread on the land and some, in a lot of cases, getting into the river. So it's a big challenge. The only way to get around it is convince them that it's in their interest to spend the money, not just to help Maryland. But that's sort of where things are starting to sort of get fractious, because as Maryland complains about Pennsylvania and threatens lawsuits, and others threaten to sue Pennsylvania, yes, then even the Democratic governor gets his back up and says this is not the way to go. Yeah. So, the partnership may be getting a little attenuated here.
Strange, sure. And then now you fold on what's happened with the coronavirus pandemic, the big economic implications from that, how the economy's gone and employment's gone, and looking at focusing on that recovery and, environmental issues kind of take more of a backseat, I guess, in the months or year ahead as people try to regroup from that,
Sure. Well, we've seen some immediate impacts already. I mean, one of the fisheries here that we don't talk about anymore, but once was the premier fishery in the bay, was with shad, and at one time they were a major fishery, commercial fishery. People ate them. Even in my youth, my dad, we would eat shad every spring. They're rarely seen now. They're still banned. They stopped allowing fishing for shad or catching them in the bay 30 years ago. Wow. Yeah, so they've been off limits here for that long, and they're still in trouble. The big, there's been an effort to restore them. Part of it has been water quality. Part of it may be fishing pressure, and a big part of it has been lack of access to spawning grounds, dams, and other obstructions that have prevented them from getting upriver. We've got a pretty decent shad population now coming into the Potomac every spring. That's the one sort of bright spot there. The Susquehanna, which used to be a major fishery, has been in trouble. And this year, because of the coronavirus, what they've been doing for years to try to bring the shad back there had to be put on hold. They would harvest shad in the bay and raise the fry and the hatchery and then release them in hopes that that would sort of help keep the population going and bring it back. And they had also been lifting them over the Conowingo Dam, which is the biggest sort of dam on the East Coast, 90-some feet in height. And at one time, that lift was doing very well. Lately, it's not been doing well at all, but it was still putting some thousands of fish upriver to spawn. This year, because of the coronavirus, the dam operator decided it wasn't safe to run the lift. And so for the first half, more than half of the spawning season, wasn't operating. They got some heat, some pressure from conservation groups and from a little bit from federal regulators, and they decided that they could maybe do it after all. They started up the lift and moved a few hundred fish, and then realized that they were also moving invasive snakeheads up the river, and so they shut it down again. So no hatchery for shad this year, no lift operation. So that's that may be just a blip. I mean, they need a much bigger lift than what's going on there right now. But that's sort of the initial feeling. The bigger question you point out about the economy, we'll have to wait and see how much of a hit states are going to take in terms of their tax revenues as a result of this. It's bound to be at least a one-year hit. Maybe it's going to last longer. I guess we'll wait and see how the economy recovers. But that means that other restoration programs, environmental programs, probably going to be not seeing an increase and probably seeing a decrease, at least for the time being. And that could be a problem. We haven't seen actual numbers yet. Yeah. So that'll be a continuing story.
Any other impacts of the coronavirus pandemic that's going on when it comes to bay restoration and its kind of core water-based industries and so forth? Obviously, a lot of the recreation kind of outfitters and stuff like that might not been having the action this spring. Anything else?
Well, I mean, Maryland actually forbade boating for a while and fishing unless it was subsistence fishing. A lot of people suddenly decided they couldn't live without fish, and they went out fishing anyway. But there was at least a brief hit from that, a couple months. The limits on boating and fishing have been taken off now. There was a surge, and there has been, I think, nationwide, of people going to parks to get out. Even though were under stay-at-home orders or working from home and that sort of thing. There have been some challenges with that, with more people getting into the parks and the public spaces, and there may be fewer people there to maintain those public spaces because of the restrictions on government workers. There's been more litter and maintenance problems, and that's sort of a minor side effect of this whole thing. Yeah. A lot of the public education and outreach that normally happens with the bay restoration has been postponed or canceled for this year, just because of the need for social distancing. So again, that could be just a minor setback, but when we're down to this point where we're trying to reach this 2025 target every year that we're losing ground or not making progress is going to make it that much harder.
Sure. I remember when I was in 8th grade, I think, we took a field trip to the bay, and I think we went to the Bay Foundation's at Claggett Farm, and we also one night, it was an overnight, we took a nighttime canoe ride through a marsh, and the moon was out and the birds were out. This was a spring thing, and it was really, really formative for me as a, 13-year-old or something. And so, like, if that was this year, that wouldn't have happened, and who knows where I would be. You mentioned Conowingo Dam, and I know that that's really kind of surged recently as a focus area. Why is that kind of that issue risen up?
Well, I mean, it's always been an issue in terms of the like the fish populations, the shad and eels, and so there's even a water quality impact from that because the eels, the American eels that migrate up the river, also carry little clams with them, which produce, help filter the water. But the bigger issue has been that the dam, because it's sat there since the 20s, has been trapping sediment and some nutrients behind the dam for decades. That reservoir, that pool behind the dam, is slowly filled up. I mean, it's not that it's not that you can see the ground there now, but it's the bottom of that reservoir is filled up to the point that water essentially flushes everything over the dam now that was used to be getting trapped. And so there's an increase of sediment and nutrient coming down through the dam. And when there's a storm, or particularly heavy rains as we had in the last couple of years, then that scours out more of that built up sediment and nutrients behind the dam and puts them downriver and into the upper bay. And, there's been modeling that shows that unless they do something about that, that it's going to be hard to reach all the water quality goals for the upper bay that they need to meet the TMDL pollution reduction targets. So, and there's the concern that if we have another big storm, a big hurricane like Agnes in '72 or Lee, that could produce a major setback in terms of just burying oyster beds and SAV beds, grass beds, and sediment, and putting a whole potload of new nutrients out there to create algae blooms and fish kills. So the state and some environmental groups, and especially those who don't really like being told that they have to clean up their own backyard, have been pointing at the Conowingo Dam and saying, yeah, but what about Conowingo Dam? What about Conowingo Dam? And so the Bay program has recognized it. That's an issue. They've decided they need to do something about that. And basically the Susquehanna. The challenge always has been, what are you going to do? Dredging it out is an incredibly expensive undertaking to create a new trapping capacity there. And it's not clear who would pay for that. Maryland attempted to use the federal licensing of that dam, which was up for renewal, as leverage to get the owner of the dam, Exelon Corporation, big power company, to pony up lots of money to help clean up the nutrients and the sediment. They wound up in court and ultimately reached a settlement, which, according to the press release, says it was $200 million commitment. Only about half of that was real cash. And there's challenges to that now, saying, in essence, that that's not nearly enough to do anything meaningful. And the license is still pending. Could wind up in court again, for all we know. So we'll see.
More of that court action.
Yes.
Of that court action, yeah.
We are a litigious society.
I wanted to ask about some positive stuff, I guess. What are, from your, years reporting on the Bay, from what you've been doing at the Bay Journal, what are some of the success stories, maybe that you haven't mentioned already, some of the areas of progress, some of the encouraging things that happen, whether that's, in a broad sense or even some specific examples?
Well, I think I mentioned before that, sewage treatment, wastewater treatment has been a big success. Part of that is technological and part of that is political and financial. I mean, engineers came up with new ways of enhanced nutrient removal from wastewater to where we've got new, sort of like a whole nutrient removal 2.0 or 3.0, whatever you want to call it. And they were able to do that with it, generally often within the footprint of the existing treatment plant, so you didn't have to start from scratch. You could add on, you could build additions and that sort of thing. And then the states primarily ponied up the money to do it. In Maryland, there was a tax or a fee, I guess you would call it, the so-called flush tax or flush fee put on every household So the money was raised to do that in Maryland. Virginia has done a similar thing. They're not with a specific targeted fee, I do not believe. And so that's been a big help. That has been a big help. Another area where there's been real progress, one that I think none of us really paid much attention to begin with, has been in terms of air quality. Because of the Clean Air Act, a lot of pressure was put on states, and this came primarily through the federal government, to clean up power plant emissions, clean up industrial emissions, and clean up auto exhaust. A lot of the nutrients that get into the bay come from the air. And, there's nitrogen that's generated as part of combustion in power plants and in auto exhaust. And that stuff rains down on the land and then washes into the bay. And it's been shown now that because of all the reductions that have been made since around 1980 in terms of emissions from power plants and automobiles, that a significant reduction in nitrogen runoff has occurred as a result of that. And so that's a plus.
That's
how much more of that we're going to see under this administration, I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's definitely something people don't think about as much, the idea of an airshed, and realizing that a pretty decent chunk of that pie, I forget what it was when I was there, 20%, 25%,
yeah.
I don't know, maybe of the nutrient pollution, nitrogen, coming in from the air.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Numbers around 20%.
Okay.
And that was originally treated as uncontrollable, if you'll remember. I mean, that was not really factored into the thinking about how you had to deal with this. But they began to look, trace back, where's this nitrogen coming off the land coming from? And what they found was, well, it's raining down out of the sky, sometimes in rain and sometimes just dry deposition. And the airshed, of course, goes beyond the watershed. The Bay watershed is 64,000 square miles. I would say the airshed is probably double that. And it stretches all the way out into the Midwest. Maryland's air quality is influenced by emissions from Ohio. Some of that also affects. And then it drifts on from there. But, and that's one of the things, too, was that this Bay cleanup has always been billed as was started out as a voluntary partnership, a voluntary agreement. It's become a bit, more regulated over time. This was a pure and simple, straight regulation for air quality, which has had a benefit for water quality. So that, independent of what the states themselves were doing.
Sure. Well, one of the angles of success stories I hope to track down on this podcast is around agriculture. I hope to find examples of where things have worked. That could be just a single farm. It could be a certain valley. It could be a stream area. So I'm going to follow up on that angle and because we got to elevate those examples and show that it can work for ag. It's such a tough area.
It's a tough area. Part of it is there are limitations on what can be done through regulation. Farmers are notoriously independent folks, and they'd much rather do these things voluntarily. A lot of the effort here in the Bay watershed has been through providing funding, federal or state funding, to them to put in runoff control practices, to plant trees along streams flowing through their pastures and fields. Not nearly enough of that has happened, and a lot of it isn't going in the places it's most needed. Yeah. So we need to step up the pace there more. Maryland spends roughly $20 million a year paying farmers to plant cover crops, which is another good thing that soaks up nutrients left in the fields after the harvest in the fall, keeps them in the plants and in the root zones. And then that's sort of an initial dose of nutrients that the next crop can take advantage of in the spring. So that's a good thing as well. There's still some questions about some of the other farm runoff control practices, how effective they are. And so there's a lot more attention that needs to be paid to that. There are a lot of farmers out there who are trying to do the right thing. And this has been an evolutionary process. Some of the advice they initially got wasn't totally correct. So there's a learning curve here still in terms of what's to work and what isn't. But there are a lot of farmers with good intentions and who are doing things and who are putting putting their own money and sweat into the effort.
Yeah.
So they certainly deserve attention.
Sure. Last question that I have, and it's based on the fantastic collection of bobbleheads you have back there from both of our favorite baseball team, apparently. Who are you more optimistic about, the Orioles or the Chesapeake Bay?
Near term or long term?
Right. Hey, I'm cautiously optimistic about the Orioles because we've got a new franchise leadership and management and a model that's kind of based on modern day analytics and everything. So you just got to give it some time. And maybe that's like the Bay also, right? Like these measures take time to see results in the water. It's going to take time to see results on the field for the O's. But
it is. And, and I guess one of the things I always say about the Bay is I think we've learned, and I've learned from the time when I first started covering this in the early 80s, that, this isn't a race with a finish line. This is going to be a constant effort. Yeah. And it's more or less the same with a baseball team, too. Even if you win a pennant, that's just one pennant. If you want to stay in contention, you have to keep building that farm system and keep putting in the effort to get back there year after year. I'm hopeful that our O's will be back in the pennant contention by 2025, if not soon.
There we go. It's a race against the TMDL.
Right.
Tim, awesome to catch up with you. A lot of great information. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.
Waterloop.
The Waterloop podcast is sponsored by High Sierra Showerheads, the smart, stylish choice for conserving water, energy, and money while enjoying an invigorating shower. Use promo code WATERLOOP for 20% off at highsierrashowerheads.com.
You're in the Waterloop.